At this time, more than anything else, this country needs a period of stability. And if, as the indications have shown, if this is correct, that the Conservative Party has won the most seats and probably the most votes, then it will be incumbent on us to ensure that we have that period of stability, and that is exactly what we will do. That is always what I have tried to do in my time as a Member of Parliament. And my resolve to do that is the same this morning as it always has been.
Hello everyone and welcome to Commoners Podcast. This week we're going to give you an update on the British election special we had last week. The election obviously took place on Thursday, June 8th, and the result was so stunning that I think we can just skip the pleasantries today, Adam, and just say, holy what happened?
The biggest political upset since World War II. Nothing like this has ever happened in modern British history. Modern British political history. It was the only time ever in which a party has gone into the polls with 50% popularity across the country and then has gone on to lose in such a way that it did. The Conservatives started the night with an 18-seat majority in Parliament. They had the majority government. They could govern by themselves, and now they're in a position in which they have lost their majority and they are now at the behest of one of the smaller parties in the Parliament. So it really is, I cannot overestimate how much this has been a failure for the Conservative Party, for Theresa May, and really for her campaign strategy. Like, it absolutely bombed.
It really is not hyperbole to say this was just completely unprecedented. Theresa May campaigned on a strong and stable government. The Tory government even was saying that you can't risk a coalition of chaos between the Labour Party, the SNP, and the Liberal Democrats. But now the Conservatives have to, it's not even a coalition. They have a confidence and supply arrangement, correct?
It looks as if it is going to be a confidence and supply arrangement, yes.
With the DUP.
Yes.
Which is a far-right Protestant extremist party.
Yes, largely.
And they don't even share the same Brexit strategy as the Conservatives.
Correct.
They're a soft Brexit party.
That's correct.
So what we've ended up with is the coalition of chaos. This is going to be an incredibly unstable government.
Yes, it will be. Do you want to run through the numbers?
Sure.
So the Conservatives ended up losing 13 of their seats and ended up with 318 on the night. That is 8 short of the 326 seats you need in the UK Parliament to get a majority. That will change just given the practical nature of some of the parties that are in Parliament, but I'll explain that a little later. The biggest winners on the night were Labour. They increased their seats by 30 to 262. The Scottish National Party, and it stings a little bit, but they lost 21 seats and they are now down at 35. The Liberal Democrats increased their seats by 4 to 12. The Democratic Unionist Party, that's the DUP that we've been talking about, so these are the now the kingmakers within the UK Parliament. They increased their seat share to 10. Sinn Féin increased their seat share to 7. Plaid Cymru, the Welsh Nationalists, managed to add 1, so they now have 4 seats. The Green Party kept their seat, and we had to say goodbye to 3 of the UK Westminster parties this time round, as the SDLP, the Social Democratic and Labour Party from Northern Ireland, who are also nationalists, the Ulster Unionist Party from Northern Ireland being the Unionist Loyalist Party, or one of them, and UKIP. So we can finally say goodbye to UKIP. They no longer have a seat, their vote share plummeted, and we are happy to see the back of them. So all in all, it was a very good night for Labour. They managed to increase their vote share 9.5% up to 40% of the vote. The Conservatives actually did increase their vote share by 5.5%, but they ended up at 42.4%. And the rest of them kind of middled around, 7-3-1. It just wasn't too impressive for some of the other parties. So it's the first time in history in which the combination of the 2 largest parties has equaled more than 80%. Sorry, not the first time in history, but the first time since the 1970s. I think it was, in fact, the election in 1970 was the last time in which the losing party got above 40%. So Labour managed to equal that. It was, especially after the last string of elections, it's the first time in which the country is quite heavily moving back to the two-party model. But the seats have fallen in such a way that even though over 80% of the country has voted for two parties, we are still kind of in a legitimate multi-party system in which we now need smaller parties to help actually form a government. And
also, the voter turnout for this election was huge. It was the largest it's been in 20 years.
That's right.
Or actually, no, since 1992 even. And it was the largest share or vote for the Labour Party since, I think it was 97 when Tony Blair was elected.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, during that election itself in 97, that was Tony Blair's landslide when he cut the Conservatives down to 130, 150 seats and managed to get 400 seats for Labour Party. And like I said, it just goes to the rather kind of odd nature of our politics at the moment, in which, the Labour Party has matched that, or has been very close to matching that, and has still only had 262 seats. But nonetheless, it's a great achievement for Corbyn, who, of course, going into this campaign was unelectable. His policies so far left-leaning that nobody thought, including most of his own party, that anyone would actually elect him or would vote for him.
And we kind of thought that too, because we've been, over the last few months, discussing the rise of a conservative populism in Europe, and you seem to be of the opinion that the UK population as a whole was sort of moving in that more conservative direction. But we've seen here in this election where the Conservatives got, 42.4% of the vote, and then Labour got just around 40%.
Yeah, that's right. There was only 2.4% between the two largest parties.
Which means the polling was fairly accurate. The ones that we were looking at where it was between 1% and 3% on the YouGov polls, I think.
Yeah, that's right. There were only two companies that managed to get it right.
It seems that the country, or at least a large section of the country, is moving away from the Tories and the Conservatives and away from their policies. And obviously, like we talked about last week, them revealing their absolute disaster of a manifesto didn't help with that. So it seems like people were able to look at the Labour manifesto and look at the Conservative manifesto, compare the policies, and on a policies grounds, because Corbyn is not incredibly popular, but on on the grounds of the actual policy, they voted in a left-leaning direction, which seems to be sort of encouraging, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, just kind of looking through the numbers here, it looks like about 52% of the country actually voted for a progressive party, Labour, Lib Dem, SNP, Green, the rest voting for Conservative to centrist, really. So it is a positive, especially given the rise of UKIP, over the past few years. I would have thought, right, British politics, we'll talk about the Overton window, the window of acceptable political ideologies is shifting out to the right. If UKIP can get elected, and they at one point did have two MPs, my thinking was, right, the country is steadily shifting out to the right. But now that Brexit's over, now that UKIP aren't really a factor much anymore, it looks like actually a number of folks that had moved out to UKIP were concerned about Brexit, but were also concerned about the welfare state, the nationalisation of the railways, the nationalisation of utilities, all of which are Corbynite left-leaning Labour policies now. And then, of course, you were talking about the manifesto, both of the parties' manifestos. Really what ended up being the failure in the Conservative campaign was their manifesto. It included, fox hunting, lifting bans on the ivory trade, and then, of course, their social plan to increase the amount of cost for elderly care. Compare that with the Labour Party, who are saying, we want to renationalise the railways, we want to nationalise utility companies, and we want to eliminate tuition fees. Of course, it was a vote for hope. There was more hope in the Labour Party manifesto. And it won the day in the end.
Yeah. Well, they did technically still lose the election, but...
Well, no, yes, you're right. It's one of these weird instances in politics in which the winners are the losers and the losers are the winners. Oftentimes in politics, it's more about direction and speed than it is about destination. In fact, I've got something here from that looks like just a listener of BBC Radio 5 Live. Can I read this to you?
Yeah.
So this is from a guy named Clive. So the Conservatives won, but lost. Labour lost, but won. The SNP won and lost in Scotland, but still won. And the Conservatives won in Scotland, but lost. UKIP lost, but because of Brexit, they've already won. The winner, Mrs May, is being told to resign because she didn't win, and she won't because she won, even though she lost. That absolutely defines this election. It's one of these odd circumstances in which the political reality of the outcome is far more real than the statistical outcome. So all those numbers, all those calculations, all the added seats and negative seats, and that doesn't really matter. What matters is the political reality of the Conservatives were blown out of the water by someone who 6 weeks ago was unelectable, themselves blowing a 50% polling popularity within the country.
And one other thing I wanted to add when it came to UKIP was, yes, they were very successful because they got Brexit done. But it seems like the country as a whole has no use for them anymore. We talked last week about how they've really sort of morphed into just the anti-Islam party. And even with the 3 recent terrorist attacks that happened within the last few months, you saw their vote go away. Like, it seems like that mood that they're trying to tap into of anti-immigration and xenophobia is not resonating with the people, and their vote counts show that. I was concerned that just because of the terrorist attacks, even so, Manchester and the London Bridge happening during the campaigning season, I would have thought. Certainly it tends to be across the board when things like that happen, especially during an election. It helps the Conservative Party, and it really didn't. You didn't see it in the polls, and you didn't see it in the final vote. So it seems like the people as a whole are sort of rejecting that and sort of being resilient to that.
So I don't tend to consider myself British, but the one thing I was very, very proud of about this country over the past few months is the nature by which we've approached the 3 terrorist attacks. So it kind of made the rounds here, some of the headlines in US newspapers in particular. Brits are reeling after 3 terrorist attacks. We're not reeling. That's the one thing I can appreciate about British culture, British people, is the stiff upper lip attitude and the very real, if not rather cheesy nowadays, a very real kind of keep calm and carry on attitude. So much so that even after 3 terrorist attacks, a substantial number of the electorate are still voting for the party of hope. So where the Conservatives are normally the party of security, and Labour doesn't have such a good, particularly under Corbyn, doesn't have a particularly good track record on security, people were still willing to vote for, a hopeful future that included, a society that actually cares for each other, that actually invests in the young, that actually invests in its welfare state and its health care system, instead of being kowtowed into this, agreeing with the Conservatives' social policies because you would agree with them on security. So I'm so happy to see that, and I'm very proud of many of the British voters that decided to say no to Theresa May, even though she was probably the better candidate on security, and voting for a larger programme of progressive change.
And something that struck me as well and encouraged me was the high turnout among younger voters who voted overwhelmingly for Labour or left-leaning parties. And that's something of a rarity in the UK, young people voting. To see that sort of engagement in the younger generation and to see them moving in a progressive direction, it makes me feel hopeful that the current policies, the current attitudes that we have will change over time, because the upcoming generation tends to be more progressive. And if you see a higher level of political engagement, that's great. And now they can feel legitimately like our votes can make a difference. So many times, especially in modern politics, it feels like the government is so detached and the rulers are so detached from the people that it doesn't feel like your vote makes a difference. And it can be very powerful when you're actually voting for something or somebody who's principled. So you're not necessarily choosing the lesser of two evils. That's a very powerful thing. I know this is the UK election special, but I know I felt that voting for Bernie Sanders in the primaries. I can't ever remember voting for somebody purely because I agreed with them on the issues and not because they weren't the other person. Yeah, I think that's a powerful motivator, and I take that as an encouraging sign that so many young people did come out and vote.
Well, not only was the turnout quite high for a British election, it was sitting about 68.7, if I remember right. They reckon that the turnout on young people, and depending where you cut off the line on young person, was between 72 and 75%. That's massive.
Wow.
That's absolutely massive. So I will be taking this particular election, the British election 2017, with me forward to show to people, particularly young people, it's like young people can make a difference if they come out to vote. The young people in this country, their participation, again, overwhelmingly in favour of the Corbyn Labour Party, has literally changed the political game in the United Kingdom. They have tied the Conservative government's hands. The Conservative government were running hard for a hard Brexit. The young people's vote have pulled them back, and we're probably now looking at a soft Brexit. The Conservative government were planning on major cuts to major systems within both the welfare state, caps on, for instance, more than two children within a family. Also, the big increase in responsibility to cover your own healthcare costs in your old age. And the young people came out and changed the game. They forced the Conservatives into a position now in which they won't be able to get any of their major platform, any of their manifesto through the Parliament. Young people literally changed the game. So I'll be taking this election with me and I'll say, look here. 75% of young people turned out and they legitimately changed the outcome. They literally changed the direction of the country. You can do this anywhere. If you actually show up to vote, you can do it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we have the same problem in the States. When I was watching the election results come in on Thursday, though, I was stunned. I mean, I know that we talked about this in our special last week that, the polls are narrowing, but you had anywhere between Conservatives leading by 10% all the way down to leading by 1%. And we talked about this last week that it was going to have to be a match made in heaven for the Labour Party for them to actually be successful in this election. They would need to have high turnout, and that high turnout would need to be among younger voters, which don't vote nearly as often as they should. And we were talking about those close polls. Those were dependent upon high voter turnout in younger voters who are going to vote overwhelmingly for the Labour Party or for left-leaning parties. And that's what happened. Those were the more accurate polls. And so you did see a difference between 1% and 3% and not 10% that some other polling institutions were going with. And so we left last week sort of hopeful because of the trend, but I never expected a result like this. I was expecting we both were expecting a conservative majority still.
Yes. My prediction was going to be a 50 to 70 seat majority for the Conservatives, and I've never been so glad to be wrong. This was also the biggest money maker for the bookies. So essentially anyone actually placing bets and gambling on this election, essentially the House won because hardly anyone bet on a hung parliament. So that's where we are with this election after only 6 weeks, actually. It's amazing how quickly these British elections turn around, especially considering that this was a snap election. It was a surprise election. No one was expecting it to happen. And then for the whole thing to just turn on its head in 6 weeks. It really is a political junkie's dream. It was fantastic.
I mean, not even 6 weeks. It was 3 weeks ago that they were still 20 points down in the polls.
Yeah,
and
right.
Even after the Manchester attack, they were still down in the polls. And then you see the manifestos come out, and they tanked after that. That was really a pivotal point. I think it sort of just woke people up and was like, okay, strong and stable on Brexit. Jeremy Corbyn wouldn't be super strong on Brexit. We get it. Okay, so we don't like the Conservatives, but we're going to vote for them anyway because we want a good deal on Brexit. And then they realized, oh wait, these are the Conservatives, and look at the policies that they actually want to put into place. And these people will be in government with a massive majority for 5 years. Do we really want to do that? And this vote was just a complete rejection of that.
Yeah, I think we've said it a few times, but Conservatives will conservative. And that is just the nature of the Conservative Party, and that was put on paper. That's what the manifestos are, by the way. So you can't just write in your manifesto, we'll be strong and stable on Brexit. Your manifesto is supposed to be your outline for governing. It's your policy issues. It's your policy stances on issues like education, healthcare, policing, security, science, like a vast range of policies that are supposed to be in your manifesto. And when people actually get a glimpse of what, social healthcare, policing, security were going to look like under the Conservatives, well, they decided to go for a little bit more of a hopeful option. And again, we're still talking about it as if the Conservatives lost and Labour won.
I know.
But that's the feeling. That's the power of political reality over, actual reality, is very much the case that Corbyn is actually now the strong and stable leader with all of his party behind him. Almost all of the MPs who, for instance, backed away from him and even rebelled against him and even planned a coup against him. They've all come out and said, yeah, you know what? Credit to Jeremy. We apologise. He has clearly proven himself. And hopefully, essentially Jeremy Corbyn has that role for as long as he wants it now. That is his role to lose.
And think about that. In a month's time, really, he went from an unelectable person to probably the most powerful and influential politician in the UK.
He's certainly treating the outcome as if he did. He actually has so the one thing that is definite about this, while things are still up in the air about possible coalitions, possible supply deals, which we'll get to in a second, one thing is absolutely certain is that Jeremy Corbyn will not be Prime Minister in this Parliament. He will not be, he cannot be, because the Conservatives will never vote for a Corbyn premiership, and the DUP are Protestant extremists from Northern Ireland. The opponents, nay, enemies of the IRA, whom Corbyn is supposedly supposed to have had these dealings with and relationships with in the past. So he's never going to have the support of the DUP, he's never going to have support of the Conservatives. Between those two parties, they have the majority. So that's one thing that will definitely be certain. But what that does give Corbyn is the freedom to say whatever the heck he wants. He can say what he wants. He can hold Theresa May's feet to the fire. He can go after the DUP for their political extremism in the past. He has a lot of influence and a lot of power, although it's soft power at this point.
Right, but even now he's pushing the issue and calling on Theresa May to resign. He said that he'll have her out within a matter of days, even, which I thought was just a pretty badass thing to say, But it just highlights, I think, how much of an absolute failure this was for Theresa May. And I know that you've said that you would have done it the exact same way, but it really is hard for me to feel empathy, I think, for her situation. It has a lot of layers to it. So you have the layer of the general populace just turning against conservative policies. Other than, Brexit. Yeah, obviously people want a strong, good Brexit deal now that you're committed to Brexit. But this election, like we keep saying, was a rejection of conservative policies overall. So you have the political mood in the country shifting towards the liberal agenda or even the democratic socialist agenda. Then you have the politics, the other layer is the politics within Parliament. So Theresa May has lost so much power. People within her own party are questioning her leadership, saying that maybe she should resign as Prime Minister. But she's sort of stuck in a job that she doesn't want, completely humiliated by what has just happened, the results of these elections. But she can't give up her post because of the third layer, in which doing that would severely weaken the UK's stance in the Brexit negotiations. And you got to know, after this, the EU 27 is just licking their chops going into these negotiations next week, because what can Theresa May really do? So on all of these layers, this has just been a failure.
Mm-hmm. I love the thought that Theresa May is stuck in a position that she no longer wants. And that is, it sounds harsh, personally humiliating to her. She deserves it, and so I don't really feel sorry for her. You're right. Brexit is the main issue why she has to stay in. Because imagine what would happen if suddenly Theresa May were to stand down. You would have someone, well, one, the Conservatives would have to run a leadership election. They'd have to figure out who their next leader was going to be. You'd probably have an interim Prime Minister or an interim leader at least. And during that time, Brexit negotiations are supposed to start. So you would be having an underprepared, rather novice amateur approach to the Brexit negotiations. Theresa May, David Davis, they've been sitting down and thinking about this for a good year. Theresa May has been in power for over 300 days, almost a full year. So they've been sitting and thinking about this and plotting what Brexit negotiations will look like. Suddenly you bring in an amateur and the entire country's position goes to pot. So she is, I would argue, taking a hit almost, staying in position, making sure that they can get the Brexit deal off the ground at least. I could see easily, actually, after someone's kind of caught up on the details, Brexit negotiations being handed over so that a new Conservative leadership race can take place. I don't see Theresa May staying in her post longer than a few months. So I would see something happen by maybe October time. And if that happens, there might be enough political pressure on the Conservatives to throw the whole thing out the window and have another election. So, but we'll have to see on that. And when it comes to Brexit itself, it's going to be very difficult to get that final deal. Remember, Theresa May has promised the Parliament would have a final say on the Brexit deal. They would be able to pass it or not pass it. And it looks now as if the soft Brexiteers have the majority in the Houses of Parliament, especially the DUP, who are now looking as if they're going to be the Conservatives' partner in government in one way or another. They are obviously an Northern Irish party and have real nerves about the idea of a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. They don't want to see the freedom of movement cut between Northern Ireland and the Republic. They don't want to see free movement cut between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK if, for instance, customs borders or passport checks had to be set up between different parts of these British Isles. So already the Conservatives' hands are tied on certain issues going into the Brexit negotiations. So they've lost certain bargaining chips, if you will. That's just going to have to be the nature of these negotiations. They're going to be defined by whoever else is in Parliament willing to back them. And that could be the DUP, it could be Labour, it could be the Lib Dems, but I can guarantee you in every instance there, they are all soft Brexiteers. They all want to maintain as much access to the free market. They want to maintain as much access to free movement as possible. So yeah, we'll have to see where that goes. One could argue that the Brexit election that never was ended up being a Brexit election in that the electorate rejected hard Brexit. Theresa
May will still have the authority to negotiate. She could try to negotiate a hard Brexit, but the political pressure from the inside is going to be for her to, in the back of her mind, she's always going to need to get a deal that she knows is going to go through Parliament.
Right, exactly.
And this arrangement that they're going to have with the DUP is not strong and stable because of the fact that the Conservatives aren't going to be able to whip the votes in the DUP because they're not the Conservative Party. So they were in a better spot before this election because at least they had the majority and you could potentially or probably whip up enough votes within your own party to make sure you could get your Brexit deal passed. But now you're partnered with a Protestant extremist party that they need to pass anything. Any legislation, and Brexit is much more contentious, I'm sure, than any domestic policy. So she's basically completely given away any sort of mandate or authority that the Conservatives had to negotiate the Brexit that they had envisioned.
Yeah, absolutely. And when it comes to other aspects of legislation beyond Brexit, as you were saying, they need support from other parties. So it looks like you're going to have to rely on the DUP. Now, maybe we should get into the DUP here a little bit.
Sure. I was going to say, why don't we've discussed how much of a failure this was, how stunning it's been, but how are things going to play out from here? Where does the government go? Can Theresa May even form a government? Is that going to be a stable government? Are we going to see another general election this year?
Sure. So as we were saying last week, there's 650 constituencies, so that's 650 individual races, and the largest party wins the constituency, and they get to represent that constituency in Parliament via their MP. That being said, with 650 MPs, that means that the majority is 326. Now, there's some odd kind of math that goes into it. So we mentioned Sinn Féin; they're the Irish Republicans. They don't
believe in the UK.
Essentially, they don't recognise any legislative body outside of Ireland. So the only two places that they are represented is the Dáil in the Republic of Ireland and at Stormont in Northern Ireland. They'll refuse to take their seats. They won't come into Westminster. But what that does is there's 7 seats. Suddenly you need to then take it off the overall total. So now you're actually looking at a majority of only 322. Now the Conservatives still lost this by 4 seats. And now you add in another little part of mathematical complexity and realise that the Speaker, who is a Conservative, doesn't actually have a vote or the ability to participate in any of the debates. So suddenly that 318 drops to 317, and they are 5 below the majority. Now, of course, in parliamentary systems, you need a majority to elect a Prime Minister to then form a government, and that can't be done by the Conservatives alone. Now, in other systems like the Netherlands and even in the French Assembly, this is very normal. Like, coalitions work all the time. That is just the nature of politics. Not so in the UK. We're not really used to coalition. We've only had one in recent history, and that was the Cameron Lib Dem, the Conservative Lib Dem government that happened in 2010. So, that being said, now the Conservatives need to look to other parties to figure out what parties would be willing to negotiate with them to make Theresa May the Prime Minister. And the only right-leaning party left in the Westminster Parliament, other than the Conservatives, are the DUP. Now, as I said, the Democratic Unionists are Protestant extremists. They are also socially conservative, so they are an anti-LGBTI rights group. They are anti-abortion. They tend to be quite hardline, almost the evangelical, kind of that hardline evangelical Christian politics that is quite well known in the States. They tend to be that, except in British politics.
Lovely.
Yeah, the only thing that they differ on would be they're actually willing to spend more public money. So they are perhaps socially very conservative, but they'd be kind of more towards the centre when it comes to economic policies, things like the welfare state, healthcare, all this good stuff.
And I think this is something that's really important for us to remember, because we're talking about this, and we've been talking about this whole episode as if this is a major victory for Labour and the left. But when you really look at the political realities of it, yes, there's been an upswing of, left-leaning sentiment in the country. The government is going to have to appease this rather fringe conservative party in order to even govern at all. So their policies may even try to lean a little bit more conservative than they currently even do, just because of the fact that they need to secure the support of the DUP, especially in this case because it's not even an official coalition.
And so, yes, there were a few options that the Conservatives had in terms of the relationship with the DUP. One, they could have set up a coalition, and this would have been a formal, almost contractual relationship between the two parties, by which the two parties would just work together on every single issue. The DUP would have been given cabinet seats in government, would be able to influence quite from the centre of the government itself, the direction of government policy. The other option is kind of more of it's called a confidence and supply agreement. Essentially, it's the party that just says, yeah, we'll support you, but for a price. And so the price, will have to be, negotiated, issue by issue, literally vote by vote. And so, what the DUP are probably going to be asking for are things like soft Brexits we've already covered, but also, more money for Northern Ireland. It's amazing how this happens. And one of the rather challenging things for the coalition is that because the smaller party are a regional party, it means that one part of the UK will end up benefiting much more than the others. So simply because the DUP are a Northern Irish party, there's going to be an influx of extra funds going into Northern Ireland simply because they can hold the government to account, that they can support the government in Westminster. I don't have a problem with this. For instance, if the SNP were supporting a Labour government at the moment, the same things would be true. Scotland itself would have benefits simply because a regional party would be supporting a Labour government. So it's not that I have an issue knowing the rules, but I do wonder what that will mean for the political stability of the current government. Because it's just so divisive, it's literally creating benefits in one part of the UK over others. And all it does is bring about this essentially a feeling of unfairness. And that's not to mention even the feelings within the Conservative Party, which has begun to fracture. So, for instance, the Conservatives from Scotland tend to be rather progressive Conservatives. They tend to be very socially liberal. For instance, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives is a gay married woman. It's just a different type of politics up in Scotland. Even the Conservatives tend to the left a little bit more, particularly socially. So what you've got is essentially a more liberal conservatism coming out of Scotland and a rather conservative conservatism coming out of Northern Ireland, and they're supposed to be supporting the same government. There's a majority of 5 seats between them. All it takes is 5 MPs to say, no, we cannot support this, and suddenly legislation falls apart. Even the Queen's speech and the budget could be at risk as soon as 5 MPs say, no, we're not going to be supporting this. So in terms of the health and stability of the government, it's going to be the least stable government that the UK has seen since, well, probably 45. There might be like one of the short parliaments in there between then, but this is certainly going to be one of the most turbulent governments, I think, in a long time.
So a very toxic political environment then.
It's going to be factional, it's going to be toxic, it's going to be ideologically split. There were rumours, although they sadly turned out to be not true, that the Scottish Conservatives were thinking of breaking away and forming their own Scottish Conservative Party. The irony of them being unionists is quite funny, but sadly that ended up not being true. But still, it's that type of environment. Suddenly there's rumours going about of challenges to Theresa May. So, for instance, the Boris Johnson team kind of putting out feelers to see if they could challenge Theresa May.
Oh my God. Can you imagine Prime Minister Boris Johnson?
I hate to break it to you, but he will probably, if Corbyn is not the next Prime Minister, it will probably be Boris Johnson.
Ugh. So really, there is no other way to put it than this is a failure of generational proportions.
Yes. It hasn't happened in a generation. If not more. If not more than
awesome.
one generation. It really is.
It's just great.
And it's good to see because, our particular ideology has a foothold now. If it was a dominant conservative majority, you wouldn't see progressive politics in the UK for at least 5 years. So it's like we sit and we laugh, and that's essentially because we're happy. We're happy.
Yeah, no, really.
And it's very good for progressivism in the country now because there is a foothold. We are there. We can actually have influence now in policy. The Conservatives' hands have been tied. It's just all around a good thing for progressive politics.
Especially since what you did see in the early 2000s was the rise of the new Labour Party under people like Tony Blair that were convinced the only way you could be relevant as a left-leaning party is if you move more towards the center. And ultimately that move really hurt the Labour Party because it split it down to two basic groups. You had the sort of left-leaning elite, and then you had, like we were talking about last week, the working class, that the party now has to appease basically both of those distinct groups that don't usually share a lot in common.
And Corbyn nailed it.
Exactly.
Nailed it. It got policies that both sides could support.
Yeah. And you have now a party that's really kind of going back to its roots and saying, well, let's take care of the working class. Let's do what's best for the little guy, and not the oligarchic nature of the government now. It just makes me so happy because you see this resurgence against this sort of neoliberalism that we've seen for the last 20 to 30 years that's just abandoned the traditional liberal base. And to see that resurging and see that not completely obliterated and wiped off the map is just, it's a relief. Because, when this election was first called, there was a very real possibility that Theresa May could have ended Jeremy Corbyn completely.
Yeah.
She could have ended this new socialist Labour Party.
I mean, we were talking
completely.
about it in our Brexit election special itself, is that my full expectation was cakewalk for the Conservatives, Corbyn would be gone in a month. That's what everyone expected.
I was expecting the intro music for this episode to be a funeral dirge, and it's the exact opposite. It's the exact opposite. It really is incredible. Just to have, and just as an aside, I've told you personally, I'm in love with British politics, even more so after this. The furious pace of this election, from absolute despair in just about a month, and actually, even if you want to break it down further, 2 to 3 weeks ago, we thought that this was over, that the Conservatives were just going to steamroll. And in that period, you had Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour Party steam up from behind and do the unthinkable, something that nobody in their right mind would have predicted could have happened.
It really does give the definition to political junkie. It is like a high. And then you kind of get your hit every day because it's only everything. It's like your 2-year American campaign squashed into 6 weeks, and all the thrills and excitement of a 2-year presidential campaign, you get every hit in 6 weeks. So there's something new every day, or multiple things coming out every day, and it's very easy to get kind of caught up in it. But it's interesting, it's fun, and especially when your own side actually ends up doing really good. And admittedly, my party suffered probably the worst. They lost 13%, or 10 to 13% of their vote share. That's a major loss, but I really don't care. One, because they are getting lazy and they need to reconsider their position on many things. And two, it's just interesting. It's just a lot of fun. And this is kind of why we do the podcast, is that we just find this stuff so interesting, so exhilarating. It's fun to see the inner workings of these countries come about, especially in democracies in which they really are legitimately the will of the people manifest into, complex systems.
So I guess you would sort of say that you can deal with the demise of the SNP because it's sort of soothed by the upswing of liberal, truly progressive sentiment in the country.
Absolutely. Yeah. I like I said, the SNP here in Scotland are actually the party of government, the party of the institution. They've been the government for the last 10 years up here. It was the Conservatives in Scotland that are actually the resurgent, insurgent, radical, rebellious party that everyone could rally behind and support. So, I mean, the SNP still won in Scotland. They still got the most seats. They still got the most votes. Had the last election not happened, in which they get 56 seats, 35 would actually be spectacular, considering that the SNP have only ever won, up to 11 seats ever, other than the 56 they won last time and the 35 they now have. So 35 would have been a great result. But given that it ended up being a constitutional issue between independence and union, and given that 62% of the country, Scotland, voted for a pro-union party, the SNP needs to reconsider their position. They need to reconsider how best to convince people that independence is the right option. And I don't think after 10 years of government, 10 years of protracted laziness, ultimately, is what it gets you being in government that long. They're beginning to convince any more people. I think they are rather stuck. So this should give them a good kick up the pants. They should be, like I said, they should reconsider their position and hopefully figure out a way forward from here. I still believe, even with Corbyn on the rise down south, with progressivism coming in the UK, I still believe that Scotland should be independent. But, if we are actually heading in that direction towards the left in the UK as a whole, I'll be much happier staying within the UK. And I think that's true for a lot of independent supporters, is that many independent supporters don't support Scotland being independent out of some kind of nationalist sentiment of anti-Englishness, but rather like they actually wanted a left-leaning government, and we've had a right-leaning government here, well, arguably since the beginning of the Thatcher era, because you had Thatcher, major Conservative, then Blair, who was not really a Labour leader, and then, the Conservatives again since. So it may actually dampen the desire for independence because, we might actually be getting a left-leaning UK quite soon.
And I think you can sort of see that happening too, because some pretty prominent figures in the independence referendum for the SNP actually lost their seats.
Yeah, we had to say goodbye to a couple big heads, as they were. So the SNP lost Angus Robertson. He was their deputy leader, actually, and their leader of the Westminster group down in London. He was actually, I'm quite sad to see him go, because he was a very good politician. He was a very good orator. He held the government's feet to the fire quite well, actually. And then we also lost Alex Salmond. He was the bigwig. He was the one who pushed through the independence referendum. He was the First Minister of Scotland, and he's been a giant in Scottish politics since the mid-1990s. Now, interesting thing that's happened is that both of these guys represented northeast constituencies. So up in the northeast is where Aberdeen is. That's where all the oil money is. And so way back when the SNP were really kind of getting off the ground, they were the oil party. They thought that any proceeds coming from the oil industry should come to Scotland and not to the UK. And so the SNP actually had a fairly strong base up in the northeast. That's when these guys were elected. But as time has moved on, it was the northeast that actually ended up being the most anti-independence, other than the borders next to England, and the most anti-Brexit. And so just as time has moved, the feelings, the political philosophy of the northeast has changed so much so that it's now actually probably going to be a conservative stronghold for a little while. And these big guys have lost their seat. So
would you say then that following this election, the SNP kind of needs to focus on domestic issues over an independence referendum?
Yeah, I think that's precisely it. So the Indie Ref 2 was supposed to be happening before Brexit, so that meant that it was going to be happening by 2019, early 2019 at the earliest. What has changed now is that I think the SNP have to focus on good governance, they have to focus on good party discipline, they have to figure out education and the police here. Two of the major domestic issues, Scotland has been falling in the education polls over the last 10 years of SNP government. The SNP government revamped the police service here in Scotland, and it hasn't performed as well since. It hasn't been as efficient. And so these are big things that need to be looked at domestically. And so I'll be happy to see them focus on that, figure those two things out, and then perhaps look at an Indie Ref after Brexit's been done, after we're out of the EU. And if Brexit ends up being soft and it's not really a big deal, then fine. But if it ends up being a hard Brexit in which we're not really, in which the promise of a good economic future for the country isn't looking good, perhaps then Scotland being independent is more attractive to the majority then. But for now, it looks as if the independence issue is rather dead. And that's well, a bit of a shame, but hey, I'm moving to Catalonia, so they're about to have their independence referendum in October.
Yeah, so you might live in an independent country after all.
Yeah, there you go. It just won't be my country, but hey.
So just by way of wrapping up, I thought I'd ask you a couple quick questions as far as your predictions as to what's going to happen.
Sure.
So first, how long does this government last?
The government will last only as long as the Prime Minister lasts. Because then what you would have is a transition into another government. So say it was Boris Johnson, suddenly you'd have a transition from the May government to the Johnson government. Given that I don't think May will see out the year, I'm going to put it in October time. And so I think by the time that, you've got someone caught up to speed on Brexit, someone like the negotiations are well on their way, you've got someone kind of negotiating on Britain's half that isn't Theresa May. I think she stands down, someone else comes in. I mean, there's already, I mentioned Boris Johnson, but there's already kind of rumours and, MPs speaking openly about the fact that she will not run another campaign. She will not, she will be Prime Minister, but she's not going to be running another campaign.
Well, the Conservative MPs are pissed about this.
Oh yeah,
I saw there was one guy who tweeted out, "We didn't shoot ourselves in the foot, we shot ourselves in the head," which is incredibly. It's totally accurate, but I can't see her lasting all that long with the just open insurrection that's happening inside the party right now.
That's largely why I say October. It's just so openly hostile to her current leadership. Again, she's kind of stuck there, and everyone kind of agrees. In fact, essentially, she can turn around to them and say, well, I'm going to call your bluff. You get rid of me, chances are you're going to need to run another election. And guess what? The guy over there just showed that he can get almost as much of the vote as we can. Give him another. In fact, do you know what? This just came out today and it just sprung to mind. There was a post-election voting intention poll for the next election, and it had Labour up 6 points.
Wow.
So she can hold them hostage, essentially, and say, look, you can change the leader if you want, but if you change me, you're going to need another election, and that guy over there can win.
Wow, so they're really they're stuck.
They are largely stuck.
They're in a terrible position.
So they need to get their ducks in a row. I think it will take them over the summer. By autumn time, I think she will stand down and you'll have a new Conservative government in place. We'll have to see what happens then.
The scope of how bad this decision was to run this election is like an onion. It has so many different layers.
It does. Of
really just errors and stupidity and bad management and judgment of the campaign. I mean, it's almost like she came out and just double freedom rockets said, what are you going to do? Vote for those guys? And lo and behold, that's exactly what happened.
40% of the country said, yep.
Oh, man. It's hilarious.
It's fantastic.
And for us, for people of our political ideology, it's an excellent result, and it's just I've taken a lot of encouragement from this election. And even we started this podcast talking about this dangerous resurgence of conservative populism, but I think as we've gone along and we've followed these elections very closely, the French election, the Dutch election, and now the UK elections, I think we've sort of seen that tempered by people who don't really want to give in to that yet.
Yeah, in the Netherlands, you definitely didn't see the far right doing as well as they should have. While you did see the far right get into the second round in the French election, they lost by, they underperformed their polls. They only get about 32, 33%. And now you've got here in the UK, in which, a left-leaning party that never should have won anything ended up really pushing the Conservatives back and down into a position of true weakness. So it is good. It's a good trend to see. Of course, there are negatives in that, 30% of France still votes far right, 20% of the Netherlands still votes far right, and those are kind of still moving up. But nonetheless, it's a good thing to see, and I'm hoping that, as we've seen in this election, that young people, that, in fact, anyone, when given the opportunity to vote for something hopeful, they'll actually take that chance and vote for something hopeful. Well, that's it. Thank you for listening to the Commoners Podcast. Remember that you can catch the Commoners Podcast every second Monday in your feed. Remember also to follow us on Twitter at Commoners Pod, and you can listen to every one of our episodes on YouTube, again searching for Commoners Podcast. If you're interested, as we're recording this, the first round of the French Legislative Assembly elections have just wrapped up with a Macron lead of 32%, it looks like, to the Republicans' 21%. So that's a massive win for Macron. This doesn't mean that any seats have been assigned yet. We need to look forward to the second round in a couple weeks' time. But for anyone who's interested in that, make sure you check it out. Thanks again for listening, and as always, stay informed.